Hello to all of the real progressives out there. Thank you so much for tuning in today. I think we have a really fantastic show for everybody today. Two excellent guests, Dr. Trita Parsi joined to give an update on the Middle East, and Afeni of Fred Hampton Leftists joined to discuss discrepancies in the coverage of missing persons based on race, as well as some other discussion of community organizing and activism. Great conversations to bring you guys, and obviously some huge stories going on right now with infrastructure, with the debt ceiling. We're going to cover Stephen Donziger being sentenced, the attorney who prosecuted Chevron, or not prosecuted, that's the wrong term, successfully sued Chevron, rather. We're going to talk about critical race theory, the teaching of critical race theory being banned in Wisconsin. Just all sorts of great stories for you guys today. Police killings found to be underreported to the surprise of nobody, but we're going to go into some of those details, and we're going to cover Josh Gottheimer's corruption. He is one of the centrist or corporate Democrats who is opposing the reconciliation bill, the $3.5 trillion reconciliation bill. So fantastic stuff to bring you all today. Want to start, as always, with the RP plugs. You guys know the drill, realprogressives.org. Go there to check out all of our great content, articles, podcasts, all that kind of stuff. You can find our Patreon there if you want to support us, realprogressives.org. And make sure not to miss all of our other content. We had an excellent macro and cheese recently with our founder, Steve Grumbine, his podcast that included budget chair John Yarmouth. Blanked on his last name for a second time out. John Yarmouth and his son Aaron joined Steve on the Macro and Cheese podcast. Yarmouth is an MMTer. He actually understands MMT. It's really critical to have somebody with that knowledge base in the position that he is in. So really want to encourage you guys to check that out. Also have a quick headliner here to show you guys for tonight's tonight's TNU episode, the new Untouchables. Fantastic series on financial corruption. Make sure not to miss it. We'll show you this little clip. Come back and continue the show.
Pecora takes over these hearings and he creates a sensation. And it's his hearings that create the momentum for Roosevelt's first 100 days in office. So in that 100 days, the Roosevelt administration and Congress pass the Banking Act of 1933, better known for its co-sponsors, Carter Glass and Henry Stigall. Glass-Steagall separated commercial banking from investment banking, a reform that only went away in 1999. More importantly than that, the Banking Act of 1933 created the FDIC and Federal Deposit Insurance, probably the most important structural change to banking really ever to come out of Washington from my point of view. Then they create the Securities Act of 1933, the very first regulation of Wall Street that Washington ever had. And a year later, it's the Securities Exchange Act of 1934 and the creation of the SEC. All of that flows directly out of what Pecora had uncovered in these hearings.
Make sure not to miss tonight's episode. And if you have not seen the previous episodes of the new Untouchables, make sure you go back and check them out. Fantastic series revealing financial corruption and sort of the details of how that comes to be as egregious as it is in today's society. So I want to start today by discussing the debt ceiling and infrastructure. Many of my viewers will know that the debt ceiling is a arbitrarily politically contrived piece of nonsense. It's totally useless outside of the political power that it grants people whenever it comes up for a vote. The debt ceiling is entirely a constraint that is decided by Congress. It's not some sort of natural occurrence. It's not like there's something about economics that dictates that we must have a debt ceiling, right? We operate on a fiat currency, and therefore we can spend as much as Congress authorizes. We can always afford to spend on anything that Congress would like to spend on. So that ceiling is just this arbitrarily enforced ceiling that Congress chooses. And then every so often, we have to vote on either raising the ceiling or eliminating the ceiling. And it creates political leverage. So the Joe Manchins of the world, or recently as well, the Mitch McConnells of the world, can take that necessary vote that the government needs to continue functioning and politicize it and leverage it for some other horrendous agenda that they would like to accomplish. So I just want to make sure that my audience understands that the debt ceiling is not some sort of macroeconomic concept. It's a politically applied constraint. It's Congress choosing to limit its ability to spend. And it unfortunately ends up being used as leverage. It ends up weaponizing some of the worst actors in our political process and ends up leading to horrendous policy because of that leverage. The debt ceiling currently set to expire sometime in mid-October. I've seen October 18th as a day that's referenced. So Congress needs to, by then, raise the debt ceiling or preferably just fucking eliminate it because it is completely useless. It does nothing to make us behave more fiscally responsible. In fact, it does quite the opposite. It discourages us from spending in responsible ways. It discourages us from spending in ways that would uplift our society. That, you know, we're dealing with a historic wealth gap. We're dealing with abject poverty for millions of people in this country. We could responsibly spend to deal with these problems if the debt ceiling were not there. Obviously, there are other political constraints as well that stand in the way of us getting the policies that we desperately need. But that debt ceiling is one of them, and it's totally arbitrary and politically imposed. So I want to make sure all of my audience understands that. Don't fall for the mainstream lines that, like, you know, running out of money, we're going to default, we're this and that. No, these are political choices. That language makes it sound like it's some sort of natural occurrence or some sort of product of economics. It's not. It's just a political decision. So I want to make sure that everybody understands that. Going into some infrastructure negotiation stuff here, that obviously has been the big story as of the last couple of weeks. Progressives had held pretty firm in terms of not decoupling the bipartisan piece of shit infrastructure bill from the reconciliation bill that would actually spend on some decent things. We have an update here. This is ABC News. Bernie Sanders says spending bill's $3.5 trillion price tag likely to be lowered, but $2 trillion is not enough for the social policy package, he added. Really, $3.5 trillion is not enough, and Bernie's acknowledged that too. In order for the bipartisan infrastructure bill and larger social spending package to pass, Senator Bernie Sanders said Sunday the $3.5 trillion budget resolution price tag will likely be lowered. Quote, $3.5 trillion should be a minimum, but I accept that there's going to have to be a give and take, Sanders told ABC This Week co-anchor Jonathan Karl. House progressives have warned leadership they will not vote on President Joe Biden's bipartisan infrastructure bill until the larger human infrastructure bill is also ready for a vote. The budget resolution calls for investments in climate change policy, child care, and other social programs, and is wider in scope than the bipartisan infrastructure bill, which includes measures to improve the nation's physical infrastructure. Quote, both these bills are going forward in tandem, Sanders said, reiterating the progressive call to hold out on passing infrastructure until the social spending bill is also passed. Moderate senators, let me just correct that, corporate senators Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema have said they will not support the bill's $3.5 trillion price tag due to the slim Democratic majority in the Senate. Neither bill will pass unless they have all the votes of the Democrats. Sinema released a statement Saturday accusing progressives of an ineffective stunt and slammed House Democratic leadership for failing to pass the bipartisan infrastructure bill. Now, notice how that is framed, you guys. Notice how that's framed. She frames it as though progressives are opposing the infrastructure bill. It's very obviously not the case. Now, that infrastructure bill is a piece of shit, but you see how she frames it like, see, these progressives just want to make nothing happen. Well, the irony is, Kyrsten Sinema wrote a book about, I don't know, 15 years ago, maybe a little less, where she touted working with Republicans. She does this fetishized bipartisanship thing to about as nauseating a degree as anybody does. And yet, here, what is she doing now? She is using that same tendency. She's hiding behind that bipartisan tendency to do nothing, to work with Republicans to tank all of it. And by the way, Kyrsten Sinema took off from D.C. to go to some fancy fundraiser with her PAC in Arizona. She claimed she was seeing a foot doctor, but the hotel confirmed that she was going to be at this fancy fucking fundraiser with her PAC. That is who Kyrsten Sinema is. She calls her hero John McCain, if you need to know anything else. So her and Manchin, kind of clearly the two corporatists that are standing in the way of this reconciliation bill getting passed by attempting to decouple it. And if you decouple it, you then can pass the shitty bipartisan bill, and then there's no more leverage left for progressives to utilize when it comes to the reconciliation bill, the $3.5 trillion, which again, as I have covered on numerous occasions, it's inadequate, you guys. It's not even close to what we need. We need 3 or 4 times that immediately. But the $3.5 trillion does do some good things. Okay, universal pre-K, tuition-free community college. It expands Medicaid and Medicare, and it does some things to address the climate. Again, not adequate, but it is better than nothing. It is the best that we are possibly going to get. So Manchin and Sinema sitting here, they want to tank it. They don't want that. Their corporate donors don't want that, right? So we'll see where this goes. I will. You guys know I've been critical as all hell of progressives in Congress, but I will give credit where it's due. They have held firm to this point, and they've refused this last week to pass that shitty infrastructure bill, which forces Manchin and Sinema to continue negotiating on the reconciliation bill. Now, I think this sign from Bernie is not a good one. I think this is a sign that we're likely going to see a large chunk of that $3.5 trillion taken off of this bill, and that is a real fucking shame. It is already inadequate. As I said, Sanders himself has acknowledged that. Many progressives have acknowledged that. Ironically, Joe Manchin was asking for $4 or $5 trillion during the election season for infrastructure. But now they're going to hide behind their incoherent deficit and debt fear-mongering, which ties into the first segment about the debt ceiling. So this is, Joe Manchin has absolutely no understanding, you guys, of how a monetary system operates. Either that or he's hiding behind things he knows to be false. One of the two is true. So I am hopeful that we can get some good out of this bill, but it looks like it's going to largely go down in flames in terms of being close to adequate. You know, I think we'll get something, but I don't think it's going to be anything close to adequate, and it's probably going to be less than $3.5 trillion. So I'm puzzled why Joe Manchin. I know Kyle Kulinski mentioned this a couple weeks ago, and he got a bunch of shit for it, but I honestly totally agree with this perspective. Joe Manchin's daughter is in hot water right now for price gouging schemes in big pharma. She was high up in a pharmaceutical company in West Virginia. I do not understand if Biden really actually wants this to get done, which he should, because this is his fucking legacy. If this doesn't get done, his legacy looks even worse than it does currently. So he should want this to get done. If that's really the case, if Biden actually wants this to get done, then why don't you go to Joe Manchin and say, hey, guess what, buddy? I'm in charge of the fucking Justice Department. Your daughter committed fraud. Your daughter engaged in price gouging schemes that screwed over sick people and blue collar workers. We're going to prosecute her to the end of the earth unless you go ahead and go along with this. I don't understand why Biden won't do it. I really don't. I know some lefties called that like engaging in corruption. Listen, I'll get my hands dirty to pass stuff that might actually contribute to saving the fucking planet. All right. If we can leverage her corruption against Joe Manchin to try to pass something good, why the fuck wouldn't we do that? Of course that should happen. And if Biden isn't doing that, then he is committing misconduct. He's refusing to do his job. That's a dereliction of duty if he's refusing to engage in that kind of negotiation. So we'll see what happens going forward with this infrastructure bill. But it's looking like the progressives held strong to a point that this is coming to a head. And unfortunately, as it comes to a head, it looks like we're going to have a lot of that $3.5 trillion knocked off. So we will keep up with this story, and we will keep up with the debt ceiling story as well. Just please, for everybody at home, understand that that is a arbitrary, politically imposed constraint. It is not, some natural part of economics that we have this debt ceiling. Okay, if you don't understand what I'm talking about, go read The Deficit Myth by Stephanie Kelton. Cannot recommend that book highly enough. The Deficit Myth, Stephanie Kelton. Go look into it. MMT informs us why that debt ceiling is not some sort of naturally occurring thing. Okay. So at this point, I want to show you guys a fantastic clip that I did with Dr. Trita Parsi. He sat down with me to discuss the negotiations with Iran over the nuclear deal. We also discussed the Middle East a little bit more broadly. He gave his thoughts on Naftali Bennett and the new Israeli administration. He gave his thoughts on our withdrawal from Afghanistan and where China might come into the picture here. So fantastic piece with Dr. Parsi. He is a professor at Johns Hopkins University. He's also the co-founder and vice president of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Dr. Parsi, unfortunately, could only join by audio, so you guys will have to look at me the whole time while he's talking, but keep your eye on the bottom of the screen there. I have his Twitter, the Quincy Institute's Twitter, and their website up throughout this discussion. So this is Dr. Parsi on giving us an update on the Middle East. So I am very happy to be here today with Dr. Trita Parsi. Dr. Parsi is a professor at Johns Hopkins University and is the co-founder and vice president of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Dr. Parsi, thank you so much for taking the time today.
Thank you for having me.
So I wanted to start by asking about, you actually just briefly before we get into the Middle East, you just maybe an hour ago, you shared a video from your colleague David Vine about our military bases all around the world and how this actually sort of puts us in a perpetual state of conflict rather than making us more secure. Can you just briefly explain that concept and how some of these military bases may make us less secure and safe?
Yeah, I think that this is David's argument, and he is the foremost authority on U.S. basing, is making it clear that it's not just that these basis makes it possible for the United States to engage militarily. It also makes it quite plausible that it does so, because the availability of the option in and of itself drives the United States in the direction of using those options. And this is a common phenomenon in many different areas. Once you have an option, you're far more likely to actually use it. Having, as his count is right now, more than 700 bases around the world, when the other nations that have the largest amount of foreign bases are France and Russia with roughly 9 to 11 bases each, you can see the massive disparity. And that gives the United States a huge advantage when it comes to using military force, which unfortunately then leads to the United States using military force far more often than it needs to. So when we look at it, and look at the infrastructure of our foreign policy, it should not be particularly surprising that we are in endless war, because we have designed our national security state to be such that we are capable of being at war everywhere at the same time, more or less. And as a result, we are at war sometime, somewhere, all the time.
Yeah, it never ceases to amaze me that while we're an occupying force, we will claim self-defense again. You know, it's like we're the occupying force to start with. It's kind of this concept that has never quite resonated with me. To dive into Iran, can you just explain some of the tensions that have arisen between Iran and Azerbaijan and what you think may occur there?
I haven't followed that issue very closely, but it seems to be fitting into a larger geopolitical chessboard in which we have seen that the Iranians are positioning themselves very close to Israel on its borders, meaning they have a presence in Syria, they have allies in Lebanon through Hezbollah, in Gaza through Hamas. The Israelis are doing the same. They're having a presence in northern Iraq, in Iraqi Kurdistan. They've had a long-standing presence in Azerbaijan, in which the Israelis have been supporting the Azeris against the Armenians. In fact, when there was talk about the Israelis using military force against Iran's nuclear program, one option for the Israelis was actually to use bases in Azerbaijan in order to attack Iran. And with the latest war that took place there, in which the Azeris won a stunning victory over the Armenians, it seems to have emboldened not only the Azeris, but also the Israeli presence there. And this seems to be at least one element of the growing tensions between Iran and Azerbaijan.
I see. And to pivot to the United States negotiations over the nuclear deal, I saw that the Iranian foreign minister came out and essentially said that there would have to be concessions on behalf of the U.S., more sanction relief than they saw in the deal with the Obama administration. Where do you see this going? Do you see these talks picking back up soon? And if you had advice to give to the Biden administration, what might that be?
I fear, unfortunately, we're in a very bad situation on the nuclear front. And to a very large extent, it is because the Biden administration early on did not do what it should have done, which is just to go back into the deal and then, once in the deal, press the Iranians to make sure that they fully live up to their obligations, which the Iranians would be foolish if they hadn't gone along with, as well as deal with other issues. Instead, we ended up first wasting 2-3 months, then a lengthy, unnecessary negotiation for something that actually should have been much more clear cut. The United States just went straight back into the Paris Agreement, no questions asked, executive order day one of Biden's presidency. Even if we didn't want to go that far, there could have been some positive measures, such as making sure that the Iranians had access to funds in order to fight COVID. For instance, the Iranians had asked for money from a loan from IMF that the IMF had made available to all countries in order to fight COVID, and the Trump administration had blocked it. That blocking could have been undone. There was money that belongs to the Iranians in South Korean banks that the Iranians used to finance imports from South Korea. It could have been unfrozen in order to allow them to be able to buy medicine. Just some positive measures that show that okay, the Biden administration is serious about this, and that wasn't done. And as a result, this whole thing dragged out, and many of us warned them that if this were to happen, it would drag out, and then we would be in a much worse situation because then it would get entangled with Iranian elections. And the Iranian elections were likely to go in the direction of the conservatives if there had not been a renewal of the JCPOA by that time. And here we are. We have now a hardline president that is going to drive a harder bargain, that is not even coming back to the table fully, only saying that it will happen soon, but it's not clear if it will happen soon or what soon means to him. And we're in a much more complicated situation and with far fewer good options for the United States. And I think this is highly problematic because at the same time, the Iranians are now doing very unhelpful things in terms of reducing their collaboration with the IAEA. We have much more limited inspections now as a result of the Iranians reducing their obligations because the US is still outside of the deal and is not living up to any of its obligations. And in the midst of this, we're seeing further escalation. The Biden administration is now talking to the Chinese, hoping to convince the Chinese to stop importing Iranian oil. I mean, at that point, we're really doing exactly the same thing as the Trump administration did, even if the Biden administration clearly has other objectives. I think they want to get back into the deal, whereas that was not the case with Trump. But we're starting to use the same tactics, the same instruments to do so. And I think it's really unfortunate because it would be an irony of tremendous proportions if the JCPOA survived 4 years of Trump but did not survive 1 year of Biden.
Yeah, that would be an almost unthinkable scenario. Is there something providing the new president with leverage, or do you view this more as just a general like devolving of the relationship?
Sorry, could you repeat?
Is something providing the new president of Iran with more leverage to take a harder line on these negotiations, or do you just view it as the relationship devolving in ways that prohibit a new agreement from being reached?
I think there's a combination of things. On the one hand, the Iranians are under the impression that they have more leverage. They're under that impression because the United States threw everything it had at the Iranians during the Trump years in terms of sanctions. The Iranians survived those sanctions. And the Iranians calculate now that the United States is not going to be able to even replicate that level of sanctions under Biden, which I don't think is a wrong assumption because at the end of the day, part of the reason why Trump could go as far as he did in terms of sanctions is because he didn't care about other issues. He didn't calculate things in a sophisticated manner. So he was totally fine sacrificing a whole lot of other American interests, such as really ruining the relationship with Europeans, just to be able to get at the Iranians. He wasn't perhaps even at times aware of some of these costs. The Biden administration is running a much more sophisticated policy. They understand that the United States has far more important priorities than Iran, and it's not going to sacrifice those priorities in order to just be able to play a game of brinkmanship with Iranians. So I think given that, the Iranians think that they're in a position in which they can, that the momentum is on their side. I don't think it's necessarily wrong, but I think it's nevertheless a miscalculation. Because fine, you have more leverage. What are you going to use the leverage for? Just to play brinkmanship, or actually be able to make sure that this issue is resolved? So again, you see the Iranians falling into the same hawkishness trap that happens so often here in Washington. Then there's another aspect that I think is a little bit more complicated, a bit more concerning. And that is that the Biden administration has made it very clear that it is not satisfied with just going back into the deal. They want what others call, the Biden administration doesn't characterize it as a guarantee, but both the Iranians and the Europeans argue that the US has insisted that Iran has to guarantee that once the US is back into the deal, the Iranians will agree to renegotiate the deal because the US wants a longer and stronger deal. And we've seen the Biden administration talking about that already back during the transition. Now, here's the problem. Here's the problem. A longer and stronger deal sounds very good to American ears. Here's what it means to the Iranians. The JCPOA at the end of the day was a negotiated punishment. The Iranians had violated the NPT. They had done a lot of things wrong on the nuclear front. As a result, the international community, by and large, had lost confidence in Iran's ability or its intentions to pursue a solely peaceful program. So Iran needed to go through a period of punishment in which it would have to prove that its program is truly peaceful. And that period would be somewhere between 15 and 20 years. And at the end of that period, the punishment would end. Iran's nuclear program would end up becoming normalized, meaning it would be no different from that of the program of Japan or Sweden or Belgium. Here comes the United States and says, you know what, we want to add another 10 to 15 years of punishment to that sentence. That's what longer means. And mindful of the fact that the US never fully managed to deliver on the sanctions relief in the first place, even under Obama. Secondly, withdrew from the agreement and has been punishing countries for living up to the agreement. So essentially, the US has not held up its own obligations in the first place, but is now coming and asking for more punishment of the Iranians without having delivered its original obligations. So you can understand that the Iranians are not particularly eager to go for that. Here's the issue. This is what I fear their calculation is. Their calculation, I think, is that they think that once they get into the deal, once the US is back into the deal, because the Iranians are already in it, negotiations over a longer and stronger deal will fail. And as a result, the JCPOA as a whole will collapse. That would put the Iranians in a worse situation because it means that that end point they were looking for will never come. The point in which the nuclear program is fully normalized will never come because of the collapse of the talks, because the US is then back in the deal. If they never go along with it and don't allow the US to come back into the deal, their calculation appears to be that if they can just ride this out for another 15 years or 10 years, they can reach that point. They will not get the benefits of sanctions relief. They will still suffer, but at least they will come out of this punishment period. It is a very risky calculation at the end of the day because there's a lot of things that could go wrong. European and European powers in the US may call their bluff and essentially say, no, we're going to pull out of the JCPOA altogether because of the game that you're playing. So I fear that they're now playing a game of trying to give the perception of movement on the JCPOA in order to keep the Europeans inside the deal, the US thinking that it's going to come back into the deal, but never really do so and drag this out. Had there been a different approach from our end, I think it's still possible, in which actually our promises of sanctions relief would make sense, would have credibility, and they don't, unfortunately. And we hadn't insisted on a longer and stronger deal even before we're back into the deal, perhaps things would be different. And if I could say one thing as to why our promises about sanctions relief are not credible, it's not because Biden administration is not serious about it. I think the Biden administration is dead serious about sanctions relief. The problem is the Biden administration is going to be in power for another 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
After that, we don't know what will happen. And the United States has proven itself to be immensely unpredictable and tremendously disrespectful of its own signature. Trump has been impeached twice, yet he is the forerunner when it comes to the Republican ticket.
Yeah.
This is not just a concern on the Iranian side. This is also a concern on the European side, because European companies are not going to go into Iran even if the US is back into the deal, because they're still going to be thinking what will happen in the next US election. So what value does this sanctions relief have to the Iranians if European companies still are not going into the Iranian market, not because of the Iranians, but because they don't trust political stability in the United States?
Yeah, I mean, Trump's actions seem to have created a very volatile situation. The other negotiations I saw that Iran was beginning to engage in are with Saudi Arabia, and those talks hadn't taken place for 4 or 5 years. Is this the conservatives winning in Iran that's leading to these talks reopening in Baghdad, and what is on the table there?
No, these talks started earlier this year when the Rouhani government was still there. It's been headed up by the National Security Council, and the individuals in that council have largely remained the same. This is primarily driven by the fact that the US is leaving the region. You see, with the US leaving the region militarily, it means that countries like Saudi Arabia, who, particularly in the last couple of years, have acted quite recklessly and in a destabilizing manner, calculating, not incorrectly, that the United States will bail them out. They have not had much of an interest in diplomacy with Iran because it was simply easier for them to just hide behind American military power as long as the US was there. Now, when they're realizing that the US is not going to be staying, that there's going to be significant changes, the extent of it is unclear to all, but nevertheless, counting that it won't change is the most unlikely scenario. We have now seen a significant new won interest on the Saudi side and the Emirati side to engage in this diplomacy with the Iranians. It has not yet led to any particular breakthroughs, except for the fact that more than 4 meetings have been held, which in and of itself is quite astonishing. It seems like one of the first things that may come out of it is a normalization of relations between Saudi and Iran, which were broken in 2016, if I'm not mistaken. So there will be reopening embassies. Again, it doesn't mean peace. It means that we will have a better ability to contain conflict and make sure that things don't get out of hand. It can lead to something much bigger, particularly on Yemen, and down the road, potentially, can't say that it's likely, but potentially, that it could also lead to a more robust dialogue within the region to establish a new security architecture in the region. What I find most encouraging and impressive with what has been going on is that all of this has been happening because of regional states themselves and driven by regional states themselves. This is not an American initiative in which the others are being dragged along. This is actually happening because the US is leaving. And it tells us something. It means that our military presence there has actually been an obstacle to regional diplomacy. And that's something we should really ponder upon, because it means that, not necessarily that has been our intention, but the fact that we were there militarily, it actually incentivized states to pursue more military solutions because they could have the US's backing, disincentivized them to pursue diplomacy. And not particularly surprising, we have seen the situation in the region, the security situation in the region deteriorate gradually over the course of the last 20 years. In fact, 1998, the region suffered from 5 military conflicts. 2020, 19 military conflicts. And that has all been during the period of American military dominance.
Yeah, we've kind of given them an easy out there, in a sense. How do you see another big player in the region? Obviously, is Israel, and Naftali Bennett now has been in office for a few months, if I'm not mistaken. How do you see their policy evolving, or do you see it evolving at all? Do you think that that Bennett will alter the policy that Netanyahu had established?
I think there's going to be some changes. I think the Bennett government is adamant about rebuilding ties with the Democratic Party. Netanyahu, openly waged a war on the Democratic Party, and became quite clear that he was pushing for Republican victories in Congress, the presidential elections, etc. And he had his own calculations for this. This is not the calculation of the Bennett government. Incidentally, I don't know why Bennett has changed his mind, but perhaps it has something to do with the fact that the Netanyahu government's calculation, or Netanyahu's calculation himself, was that he was abandoning the Jewish American community. He did not see them as the type of loyal ally that he wanted. And as a result, him going at war with the Democratic Party made sense, because what he instead wanted to invest in was the evangelicals in the United States. And we've definitely seen that in the last couple of years. Of course, the evangelicals have been very, very pro-Israel, very pro-Likud and Netanyahu. But that too is interestingly changing. Latest polls have shown that younger evangelicals do not at all share the same type of interest and support for the policies of the Israeli state, even including vis-a-vis the Palestinians as older evangelicals. So that strategic bet that Netanyahu had made of shifting his support and investing in the evangelical movement seems to actually have started to backfire. And if that is the case, that may be part of the reason why the Bennett government is changing its tone and trying to make sure that it doesn't engage in the same war. However, what does that mean in practice? Well, first of all, I think the Biden administration is absolutely thrilled not having to deal with Netanyahu, not having to deal with someone who not only would use Congress against the administration, but also would publicly, constantly rally against the Biden administration's policies, particularly on the JCPOA. Bennett has promised not to do so. So far, we have not seen the Bennett government do that. The Bennett government, however, is not adopting rhetorically a different position. They're still very much talking about Iran as if it's an existential threat. And we saw his speech at the UN was all focused on Iran, not a single mention of the Palestinians. And I think that is because at the end of the day, the Bennett government's calculation is not terribly different. If the Israelis are not fanning the flames of this Iran threat, which I think they have largely exaggerated, then the fear is that the United States will not pay as much attention to it. And as a result, perhaps Biden will strike a less attractive deal with Iran. So they're going to keep that rhetorical level very high, laser focused on Iran, but it's going to be focused on the Iranians. It's not going to be focused on Biden's policy in the same way.
I see. And then lastly here, and I don't want to take up too much of your time, but I wanted to just quickly get your thoughts on where you see Afghanistan going from here with the U.S. withdrawing and the Taliban taking over. I've heard some speculation that China may involve themselves in Afghanistan. Do you see that as a possibility? And if not, what do you see Afghanistan falling into at this point?
Well, first of all, I think the Biden administration absolutely made the right decision of pulling out. This was something that should have been done much earlier. I think General Milley's testimony, was it now 2 days ago in Congress, put the final nail in the coffin of those who argued for a longer stay there, because he said that he had recommended using, I think, roughly 3,000 troops to keep the Kabul government in power. And he believed that 3,000 troops would have been sufficient for that. But when questioned, he was asked, well, that means that they would have to stay there indefinitely, because it's not as if those 3,000 would have been able to fix the situation and then leave. And then he says, yes, they would stay indefinitely. Would that mean that US soldiers would be put at unnecessary risk? His answer again, yes, it would do so. So again, I think it's kind of interesting. From the military side, their job is to say, hey, this is what we can do. This is the number of troops we need. Doesn't necessarily mean they think politically it's the wise thing. And that questioning made it very clear. If he's asked, can you keep the Kabul government in place? Yes, give me 3,000 troops and give me infinite amount of time. I'll do it. But is that the right thing to do? Is it the wise thing to do? Is it the thing that actually serves U.S. interests? That's a completely different question. And the way that he answered those questions made it very clear. He's not denying that it would need indefinite military presence. He's not denying that it would put unnecessary risk at U.S. soldiers, which makes it quite different from some of those in the Washington establishment who have been putting forward these fantasy arguments that, just a couple of more hundred troops, 1,000 troops, we could fix it. And, you're so pessimistic. Well, how did you think that we only needed 2 decades? We need 5 decades or whatever. So I think the final nail in that coffin was delivered by Milley himself there. Where things go now is, of course, extremely difficult to tell. I don't believe that this is a particularly different Taliban. Certainly, I'm sure they have become a bit more sophisticated, having engaged in all of these different negotiations, not just with the US, but with other states as well. But now the onus is on them. They have the country. Now they have to govern. And ultimately, their ability to be able to survive is if they actually can deliver to the Afghan people. I have my significant doubts. But it is something the Afghans are going to have to figure out for themselves. We have to walk away from the belief that every problem in the world requires an American solution. America is not the solution to every problem in the world. Oftentimes, even though our intent may be purely good and positive, it does not matter because intent is not decisive here. We end up making things worse. And we should not be involved in that. We should not make things worse just because we want to play heroes or anything like that. And we should recognize that this is an ancient country that has a pride and dignity in finding its own solutions. And we should also recognize that we don't understand everything about Afghanistan. In fact, we probably don't understand much about Afghanistan. So it takes a massive amount of arrogance to know that you don't understand the problem, yet think that you are the solution.
The solution to it. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And just very quickly, do you see the Taliban being able to withstand ISIS-K, and do you view China as a potential to intervene there or not? I obviously, I completely agree. We needed to get out. I'm just curious where you see the region going forward.
I don't find it very likely that the Chinese are going to intervene. I don't think they look at what we have done in the last 20 years and say, hey, let me have a go.
Let's do that. Yeah.
I find that extremely unlikely. However, they have a border with Afghanistan. They are very worried about the spread of ISIS-K. They're very worried because of their own Muslim population, which the Chinese are severely abusing. And so I think they have an interest in getting some stability there. And I think they have an interest to also make sure that ISIS-K is eliminated and defeated. In that sense, their interests, at least on those levels, do not diverge from that of the United States. And if they end up getting involved, not the way we did, but they get involved in such a way together with the Russians, the Pakistanis, and the Iranians, because they're having their own dialogue about this as well. And it actually handles, to the extent possible, the terrorism threat coming from ISIS-K in Afghanistan, then that is a good thing that we should applaud and welcome. Many people in Washington are uncomfortable about that situation because even if the result is good, they don't like it when other countries manage to fix things without us. And I think that's a problem. We should actually be very grateful that we don't have to use our resources and our blood and treasure to resolve problems when other countries have the same incentives to resolve them and are capable of doing so without using our resources.
Yeah, no, I think it kind of reveals our true intentions there. I mean, if what we really wanted was stability, wouldn't we be thrilled that someone else could offer it? I really want to thank you for taking the time today.
And I want to. You're
please.
Putting your finger on it. You're really putting your finger on it. If our aim was stability, we would be thrilled and we would applaud it. Unfortunately, our aim is not necessarily stability. Our aim is control and dominance. And that's what we're losing when other countries are resolving these problems.
Absolutely. 100% agree with that. Yeah. I really want to encourage my viewers to follow Dr. Parsi and his work. I've had his Twitter as well as the Quincy Institute's Twitter and their website up on the screen throughout this interview. Make sure you're keeping up on all of the content that they're putting out. And Dr. Parsi, I really want to thank you for taking the time today.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
So I thought that was a really fantastic segment there with Dr. Parsi. I was thrilled to get to talk to him. I've long been a fan of his work and the Quincy Institute's work as a whole. They keep me informed on foreign policy, which, you know, I tend to gravitate more towards economics and domestic issues. So when I get the chance to digest some of the content over there at the Quincy Institute, it's you know, keeps everybody informed. Really want to encourage everybody to follow their work. They do great work over there, and follow Dr. Parsi at tparsi on Twitter. Excellent stuff there. And, you know, I think it's really important to understand the dynamics of the Middle East and what role the United States plays, what role Israel plays. Obviously, China is a huge power right now, and there's so many angles to all of this that I just think it's incredibly important to keep up on. And huge thanks to Dr. Parsi for giving us an update. I want to talk about the sentence that Stephen Donziger was given. For those that haven't followed the story, it's rather crazy. He successfully sued Chevron for destroying the environment and causing harm to people with environmental destruction, this kind of thing. And Chevron has basically gone after him and gotten him held in contempt of court. And he's he's being given sentences that are like multiple times longer than anybody has ever been given for this kind of charge, right? It's really quite absurd. It's very clear that that Chevron is taking this out on him, and that the courts are obliging. This is in The Guardian. Lawyer Stephen Donziger gets 6-month sentence for contempt in Chevron battle. Judge orders prison for indigenous rights campaigner despite UN experts' opinion that his treatment broke international law. Stephen Donziger, the U.S. indigenous rights campaigner and lawyer who spent decades battling the energy firm Chevron over pollution in the Ecuadorian rainforest, was sentenced to 6 months imprisonment on Friday for criminal contempt charges arising from a lawsuit brought by the oil giant. Donziger, who was disbarred from practicing law in New York last year, was found guilty in May of defying court orders, including by failing to turn over his computer and other electronic devices. Friday's sentence, handed down by federal judge Loretta Preska in Manhattan, came a day after he asked the court to consider an opinion by independent UN experts that found his court-ordered home confinement of more than 2 years was a violation of international human rights law. This is just insane, you guys. The UN experts' opinion said the U.S. breached international law by putting Donziger under house arrest for about 4 times the maximum sentence of 6 months that he has now received in his contempt case. So he got 2 years of house arrest. They're not counting that as time served, and now they're giving him the maximum, which is 6 months. So he's going to serve 2.5 years, or a little over, I think, 2.5 years, for a crime where the maximum is supposed to be 6 months. And it's all fugazi anyway, you guys. Like, this is, Chevron is mad that they got successfully sued and they went after him. So it's not like there's any legitimacy to this charge to start with. But even if there was, he is now serving 5 times the maximum for this charge. And contempt, you guys, it's not like it's not like he went out and assaulted somebody. Okay, contempt of court is this kind of nuanced, you know, law anyway. Really insane here. The experts appointed by the Geneva-based UN Human Rights Council said that the appropriate remedy would be to accord Donziger an enforceable right to compensation. So they're saying not only should you not throw him away for 6 months, you should compensate him for having him on house arrest for 2+ years. That's the opinion of the United Nations. Amnesty International also petitioned U.S. authorities to promptly implement the decision by the UN Working Group on arbitrary detention, calling for an immediate release of Stephen Donziger. While Preska was not bound to consider the UN expert's testimony that Donziger had been unlawfully confined, she imposed an unexpectedly tough sentence. Quote, "It seems that only the proverbial 2x4 between the eyes will instill in him any respect for the law," she said from the bench. Absolutely unhinged and insane. That is unhinged is really the only word that comes to mind, you guys. I mean, I don't even know where to start with this one. How often do you think lawyers for corporations and for Chevron skirt the law and avoid contempt charges? I don't even know where to start with this one. This is the risk that comes with going after these giants. And this is part of how this corruption sort of maintains itself and props itself up. Because even when you're legally correct, when the system should help you, it sides with the big guy. So there's this fear that's instilled in any attorney that might consider suing a Chevron or a big bank or a big corporation or what have you. There's this fear instilled in them that, hey, even if I win this case, which should be beyond celebratory, that's highlight of a career kind of stuff, right? It should be a massive moment. They turn that moment instead into this moment of fear. Oh shit, what's Chevron gonna do now? You know, that's part of how this corruption props itself up and maintains itself. And Stephen Donziger is a perfect, example of this. It just kind of embodies all of the problems with our system. He wins a case that it was like a miracle to win that case, right? Because everything legally is built to protect the powerful. So to even win that case is huge. And then this is the result. So for those that haven't kept up on his case, I really encourage you to look into it. It is ridiculous. I mean, it's one of these things where I could probably cover a story or two like this every fucking week because our legal system is so designed to protect the powerful. But this one is so explicit and it's so obvious and so just right out in your face kind of, and it demonstrates a lot of the problems with our legal system and our inability to hold powerful institutions and companies to any sort of account whatsoever. So I'm hoping that this will somehow change, but I'm not naive enough to expect it to. I think that unfortunately he is going to have to serve 6 months for the crime of I keep saying prosecuting, for the crime of successfully suing a corporation for damaging the environment and for their rapacious business model. So this is a wild story, and we'll keep up with this if there are any updates, but I hope like hell that something changes. But again, I'm not naive enough to expect it to. Also wanted to talk today about critical race theory. This is not necessarily unique to Wisconsin, but conservatives all over the country are trying to ban the teaching of critical race theory. And before we dive into the specifics here, I just want to note, you guys, and this should be really obvious, but the same people who constantly cry snowflake and constantly say that, what we really need is a free exchange of ideas, right? And all this kind of nonsense. They're the people who will ban the teaching of social concepts, right? You cannot make up the extent of the rank hypocrisy on behalf of conservatives in this instance. They obviously do not want kids learning about critical race theory because what do most of these people benefit substantially from? They benefit from a society that favors the white community. Let's just call it what it is. They understand that if we teach children that our society has racism cooked into its institutions, into its social institutions, economic institutions, political and legal institutions, etc. If we explain, look, this racism is cooked into this, their perspective on the country will be very different from what conservatives want it to be, right? You see how there's this sort of natural incentive for them to oppose the teaching of this stuff. But I just find it so hilarious that the same people who will cry tone police or free speech police or this and that, they're the same people who will literally ban teaching of social concepts that they think are threats to their ideology and their worldview. How revealing, how pathetically insecure, right? I mean, you're basically taking a shot at your own ideology if you say it cannot withstand the teaching of this concept, right? So I wanted to set that aside before we dive into the specifics here. But we have an article in U.S. News. Wisconsin Assembly set to vote on critical race theory ban. Wisconsin public schools would be prohibited from teaching students and training employees about concepts such as systemic racism and implicit bias under a Republican bill up for passage in the state assembly. That did pass, by the way, you guys. This article is from a few days ago. Wisconsin public schools would be prohibited from teaching students and training employees about concepts such as systemic racism and implicit bias under a Republican bill up for passage Tuesday in the state assembly. The measure would also have to pass the state Senate before it would head to Democratic Governor Tony Evers, who almost certainly would veto it. That's the saving grace here, but I want to talk about it anyway. The bill has no Democratic co-sponsors, but they don't have the votes to stop it in the legislature. Wisconsin's proposal follows a national trend of Republican-controlled legislatures moving to thwart certain ideas they associate with critical race theory, a framework legal scholars developed in the 1970s and 80s that centers on the view that racism is systemic in the nation's institutions and serves to maintain the dominance of whites in society. Quote, "This is a Republican attempt to defund education by usurping local district policies and entangling school districts as well as independent charter schools in lawsuits based solely on opinions and not facts," Democratic State Rep. Lakeisha Myers of Milwaukee said before debate began. So again, it's not likely that this will pass in Wisconsin because Evers is the governor and he's a Democrat. But I've seen this happen. I think Florida had a similar bill come up. This is a trend across the country, which is why I wanted to cover it. And critical race theory, you guys, I think it's really important. Right? First of all, let me take one step back. First of all, if your child is learning critical race theory, your child is a law student or a graduate student. Okay, we're not currently teaching this to like high schoolers as much as I wish we would, much to my chagrin. I think this should be part of social studies in high school. It really teaches it's a key piece of the puzzle of the history of this country, if you ask me. But I also wanted to note really quickly, I did maybe a month and a half or 2 months ago, I had Iramiyose Frimpong on. He's a doctoral student at the University of Georgia. He's been on the show a couple of times. Hope to have him on the show again. He's fantastic. You can find his work at the Funky Academic channel on YouTube. He came on, and if you guys haven't seen the clip, go find that. We talked for about an hour about critical race theory. He explained it quite brilliantly. If you have any questions about what critical race theory is or are interested in learning more, go find that interview. Irami does all sorts of great content on that kind of topic matter. But it's really just teaching the relationship between race and society as it exists. Okay, he had this great metaphor in that video where he showed a chessboard like zoomed in, so you could only see maybe 9 squares or 12 squares or something, right? And he's like, the board might look one way when you're zoomed in like this. You might say, oh, black is dominating or white is dominating, or it looks like an even game, right? But as you zoom out and you add other pieces around that little zoomed in portion, the game can completely change. Well, that's kind of what critical race theory does for this analysis, right? If you're looking at things explicitly, you're only looking at part of the chessboard. And when you zoom out, the game totally changes. So I want to encourage everybody to look into critical race theory if you have not done so yet. I think it's very important for people to understand just as a social concept. If you're interested in American history and understanding how our institutions operate, you really should have at least a rudimentary understanding of critical legal theory and critical race theory. So check out Irami's work if you have not done so yet. But I think it's very revealing that like any time that you are saying, I can't beat that, I just need to ban it from being said, I think that's kind of revealing, you know? My question to conservatives would be, the entire history of education in this country has neglected to teach us about the reality of race in this country. Okay, you guys will see this later. I talked to Afeni of Fred Hampton Leftists, which we're going to show you that clip momentarily here. And I mentioned in that clip that I went to high school not all that long ago, you guys. Not all that long ago. I was not taught about the Trail of Tears. Not once. That was totally left out of the discussion. Major part of American history. Major part of how our country came to be. And yet they just leave it out. The genocide of the indigenous communities that originally lived here, right? That kind of thing. That's what I would say to the conservatives here. You have had almost 250 years of having it your way, where we leave all of this stuff out of the discussion. We censor anything to do with critical race theory, anything to do with the Trail of Tears, anything to do with slavery, or at the very least, we teach it in a very one-sided way, right? There was that famous textbook from Texas that said something about how like the slaves were better off or something like the way this is all framed in how we teach our children has long been on the side of these white nationalist conservative pricks. Okay. We have largely censored the truth in this regard. So I would say to the conservatives, you've had it your way for 200 some odd years. If you really think you can't compete with that, if you think teaching critical race theory is just going to put your whole ideology in shambles, you're admitting that your ideology is nonsense to start with. It's incoherent to start with. It can't stand up on its own anyway. So that would be my argument there. But I do want to note that this is a concerning trend. If you get enough states that start banning this kind of stuff, that's a very, very concerning trend. To censor the teaching of reality in favor of this sort of, I think it really boils down to patriotism. I think it's that they can't acknowledge that their country is not only imperfect but catastrophically imperfect. So they have to ignore anything that criticizes our institutions. So to favor that over truth is a deeply, deeply concerning trend to anybody who considers themselves principled. And I wanted to make sure to note that. We'll continue to cover that story as it presents itself as well. But really disturbing stuff in many ways, right? So I have been plugging this segment with Afeni of Fred Hampton Leftists. We're going to show you that now. If you guys haven't followed their work, go follow them at Fred Hampton Left. And I have Afeni's Twitter up on the screen here, as well as her organization's information. Afeni is an activist and organizer, does political commentary as well. This was a fantastic discussion on the discrepancies between coverage based upon race when it comes to missing persons. We also talked more broadly about organizing and activism and politics as well. So a great discussion here with Afeni. Enjoy. So I am thrilled to be here today with Afeni from Fred Hampton Leftists. Afeni, thank you so much for taking the time.
Hi, super excited to be here.
So first of all, can we just get a quick plug for all the stuff you guys are working on over there? I was hoping you could talk a little bit about the General Strike Summit and what activities you guys have going on at the moment.
Yeah, please definitely keep your eye out for updates on the General Strike Summit. Follow us on Twitter at Fred Hampton Leftist if you don't already. Oh, Fred Hampton Left, I think, on Twitter. But yeah, the General Strike Summit is going to be just a conversation about what a long and sustained general strike can look like. So we're super excited, and please follow us for updates. And follow the channel on YouTube to find all the content. We're always doing content every single day. Somebody's doing something. I think tomorrow is actually going to be CJ's show at 3 p.m. Eastern. So Straight Out of Politics. Please watch that. And yeah.
Sweet. Right on. Yeah, definitely encourage everybody to follow. It's a great group. You guys are putting out great stuff all the time. So a huge shout out to all of you, and make sure that you're following them if you're not. I've seen you tweet quite a bit lately about, obviously, this Gabby Petito story has gotten a whole hell of a lot of attention in the media. And you pointed out the discrepancy in coverage between missing white kids and missing black kids. And I actually have a little graphic here that I'll throw up on the screen. This, believe it or not, is courtesy of CNN, which kind of stuns me. But you can see here that 57% of missing children are white or Hispanic, 37% are black, 6% others, and only 14% of children are black kids. So it's clear, like, it's a very large portion of missing children are black, and yet the media coverage does not seem to match that. So can you talk a little bit about that and what you think might cause that?
Absolutely. I think it's because there is a devaluing of Black people in this country that has been ongoing ever since we got here. We were treated like animals, to be breeded, to be whipped and beaten, to be sold like property. So it's not surprising that, being only 165 or so years removed from that there's still some underlying attitudes of our dehumanization. And I do want to say, like, I think that Gabby deserves justice, and whatever that looks like. I'm also an abolitionist, so I don't really believe in incarceration. I don't celebrate cops in any way. So, I do think that there needs to be accountability for the harm that was caused to her. But it's been happening for what now? I think 9 days straight. We've heard Gabby's name on the news for 9 days straight. And you see that same pattern with missing white women like Natalie Holloway. In 2015, they did a 10-year memorial piece on Natalie Holloway. There are many missing Black children. Relisha Rudd, for example, she's missing. She's been missing for quite some time. Nobody's looking for her. Her family's looking for her. The authorities aren't looking for her, though. The police, the resources that were put behind Gabby aren't being put behind her, though. And that's the issue. We don't, people always ask, well, why do people always have to bring up race? And it's because, like, you can see it. Like, we can see the care and consideration that's being put into this woman and to her family as well. We can see the resources that were put behind finding her. We can see, the national media attention that she's getting, that Black women do not get, that Indigenous women do not get. Indigenous women disappear in Wyoming, where they found Gabby, all the time, and nobody puts the resources forward to find them in the way that they found, in the way that they did for Gabby and found her. So that's really the biggest thing. It's really about asking for equity. It's not saying that, her life does not matter at all, or that we shouldn't be paying attention to her, that she shouldn't get attention. She should. There should be accountability in that case, but that means every person, every woman, every non-binary person, every trans woman that has went missing, we need to look for them too. We need to put resources behind them too, because their families also need closure.
100%. Yeah, it's not the coverage of it's the extent of the coverage and the comparison, right? It's not that she doesn't deserve to get some media coverage or some mention in the media. Of course she does, but we're asking for equity here and for equal treatment of everybody. And to double down on that point, there was a 2015 study that in 2015, this is according to the FBI database, 35% of missing kids in 2015 were Black. They got 7% of the media mentions, and that's just too clear and obvious, right? It's pretty obvious what's happening here. And also I'll ask you to comment on this. Gabby's own family came out and asked all of the online sleuths who've been like trying to piece things together and help find Gabby. Her parents came out and said, we'd like you to do that for other people too. So I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to that. Like what can people do to try to address this?
I would just say put that same amount of care behind it. Like, we see, at least, I'm a Black person, so I have curated my timeline to include a lot of other Black people. So I'm a part of what they call Black Twitter. On Black Twitter, like, people circulate all the time. We are asking that circulation that probably passes some of our white peoples, some of these white people that follow us. I know a lot of white people follow me, and I retweet a lot of these things. Push that out, keep pushing that out the same way that they pushed out Gabby Petito's story. Push out these stories as well, because again, these people also deserve to be found. These women also deserve to be found. These children also deserve to be found. And I appreciate the family coming out and saying that and not getting defensive and understanding the reason why this attention is being brought at this moment is because it's just another, it is some more salt in the wound, really, for Black people. Considering that we have not gotten proper atonement. There has not been proper atonement for the actions and the harms that have been perpetuated against us in this country. And then on top of that, there is this epidemic of Black women, Black children, Black non-binary, and Black trans people disappearing. And we are trying to raise awareness about it. And the media does not pick it up. The reason why, and America is one of the most propagandized countries in the world. The reason why some people are still paying attention to this story is because the media has not moved on yet. Like, let's be real, the news cycle is fast, and the way capitalism and consumption has conditioned us all to be, if you are not actually paying attention, if you are just taking in what CNN or MSNBC or Fox News is feeding you, then your mind is already somewhere else in a couple of weeks if they want it to be. And that's just a sad reality. So we all have to be aware of these things, and we all have to build the community around these things and force the media to pay attention to these things in the same ways that they just paid attention to Gabby Petito because she was a pretty white girl, and she was a representation of this power structure in this country. Proximity to whiteness is power. Unfortunately, that's just the case. So it's just, we want all of the same things. And I am grateful for her family for saying that as well.
Right. It's not, this is not their fault, right? We should give the caveat. This isn't about being anti-Gabby or anti-Gabby's families. this may be a very difficult question, and it may kind of just be all the above, but what do you think causes that? I mean, do you think there's just explicit racism in the newsrooms, or do you think that they're catering to the explicit racism of the country, trying to gain viewership, or like, what do you see causing that to continue this far? You know, it's 2021. What do you see causing that to continue to be the case even now?
I mean, America is a country that was built on stolen land by stolen people. This country was founded on racism and on capitalism and on meritocracy. This country literally only created citizenship to exclude blackness.
Mm-hmm.
And the ever expanding idea of whiteness is always to exclude blackness. We have spread our anti-blackness globally. Like during the Vietnam War, you know, a lot of the black people that died, some of them were getting shot by the Viet Cong, but a lot of them were getting shot behind their backs by the people that were supposed to be on the same side as them. So this is a long-standing attitude of dehumanization in this country. So I think that, like, let's just be real. A lot of people don't see black people or black children as innocent. They don't see them as pure. They don't see them as worthy of being looked for, found, cared for. Because, you know, what is it? 100 and less than 100 years ago, really, black people were just getting hung all over the place. Like that's still this country. In the between 1930 and 1973 in North Carolina, they were forcibly sterilizing black women so that way they could cut off our generations. They were doing that. So for the media to still have let's be real, like a fucked up view of black people enough to not really want to pay attention to them, that's because this country still feels that way about black people. We can't even have an honest conversation about the history of slavery in this country. We can't even have an honest conversation about what it looks like to actually atone for those actions in this country without it becoming something that's a culture war or what about me? Like, it's not a what about me. This is not something that you can what about me or make universal, because these harms were not universal. So I just, you know, you asked me this question and like, I understand why you asked it. But it's just, anti-blackness is everywhere. So of course it's in the newsrooms. It's just, what this country is founded on.
You mentioned reparations. I think there's actually a little bit of a correlation here, just in terms of media coverage. Like that's treated like an extreme position by the mainstream press. And I don't think it's even close to an extreme position. It seems a very reasonable position to say, hey, we should probably make up for all of this horrendous harm over the entire history of this nation. We've treated these people like property. Do you see correlations there, and do you see any progress coming? I mean, do you think that we're headed in the right direction on those issues, or do you think it's just it's so deeply ingrained that we're still in this sort of limbo?
I think not enough people know about the harms to understand what reparations is even for. Like, I think that because of the way our educational system has kind of watered down the history of this country and the atrocities of this country, that we haven't even, like, we're not unpacking things that the CIA has done in our history books, and we should be. We very well should be. We are not unpacking the things that the military has done. A lot of the atrocities that the U.S. military has caused. We are not even unpacking that. So of course we're not unpacking the true and honest, like, terrible history of this country and of the brutality of against black people. Not only black people, though, also indigenous people. Like, indigenous people need their land back. Like, we're not even having that conversation. That's something that's not even being said. So like, for me as a black person, as a black queer woman especially, the conversation about reparations is something that's, I don't feel like is being had enough, not even in the black community. I feel like we need to be talking about this, and we also need to be talking about the steps that it would take in order for people to understand, number one, what exactly we need reparations for. Because unless we are actually being honest about that, people are always going to fight back against it. It's always going to seem like a special privilege, when at the end of the day, and the average white person is born 3 times more wealthy than a black person is, just for popping out.
Yep.
You are 3 times more valuable to this country. Through the financial sector, through the ways that like y'all are not being massively incarcerated. Like there are a lot of white people in jail, but that's because there are a lot of white people in this country. So it isn't disproportionate. Like nobody, like no one should be in jail. Let's be very clear about that. But there are a lot of us there. So it's just, there are so many different things to talk about when you talk about reparations. It's not only reparations for chattel slavery and for the Mid-Atlantic slave trade, but we're talking about reparations for white supremacist violence in this country. We're talking about reparations for the financial institutions in this country. We are talking about reparations for housing discrimination. We are talking about reparations for the healthcare sector. We are talking about reparations for, like, we can go down the list of environmental racism. Like we have a lot of different things. Police brutality. We need you to run us a check and some resources for all of that. For all of that.
No, like you say, it's in almost any given category. I mean, in healthcare, Black women get by far the worst results. We could talk about housing discrimination. We could talk about generational wealth. We could talk about income discrimination, all this kind of stuff. And also, you know, we're living in a time now where, like, again, I'll say, even in 2021, like, I'd really like to think that the people I grew up with, my generation, were a lot better about this than the previous generation. And yet still, we have states that are openly banning the teaching of critical race theory. So, you know, how are we supposed to get to a place where people understand reparations if we literally say we're not even going to teach you, you know, why that is necessary, right? And just to give an anecdotal version of this, I was not in high school all that long ago. I didn't learn about the Trail of Tears not once. That's a part of history that just gets totally tossed out the window, right? So yeah, I mean, you know, so you know, can you speak to some of that, like how we're not even attempting to get people to understand this stuff, let alone to take action that's necessary to you know, amend the situation as best as possible?
Wow. So, you know, I found out that in Texas, they were like describing slavery as like indentured servitude, or like slavery as in like workers, like a profession. Like this was something they were choosing to do. Like, that's not how that worked. That's not how that worked. That's not how that power dynamic worked. That's not how the language barrier worked. That's not how that worked. That's not how that worked.
Yeah.
So to know that, I mean, at least when I was in high school, I felt like I was in high school all that long ago. But I was also in AP, like I was also in like AP history classes. But I remember like the Trail of Tears, but it was definitely like a light brush, like, oh yeah, and Andrew Jackson did this and da 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 da. Like, it was like, you know, like it was just like so we're gonna talk about it, we're gonna run past it though. Like, just look and run. Like, don't actually settle on it, don't ingest anything, don't internalize what you just saw, just know that it happened and move on. Like, and you know, for a really long time, like even before I was an activist and before like I'd fully decolonized my mind and I like really dove into a lot of like the unlearned history of this country, like I used to always say like, yo, like the things that we're seeing in Palestine, that is the same thing that happened to the Native Americans. We're just watching it in real time. Not Native Americans. I hate calling them that. Oh my gosh, that was so bad. Indigenous people. Like, we're watching that in Palestine in real time. The annexation of land, the subjugation, the genocide, the destruction of their culture. Like, we're watching it. So it's just like, I understand it to a certain extent, because like how do you know if you just don't know? Like, ignorance is bliss. And even now, like all of the disparities in the educational system, now that especially they're doing like this virtual learning, a lot of teachers aren't even being like paid well. A lot of classes aren't even being taught. Kids aren't being taught music. They're not being taught arts. They're not getting active. There are so many components of education that is missing right now. Like, and I'm sorry if this is like far out, but like this is all a part of like the way they make sure that keep us like low information to make sure that we continue to keep their system going. Like they don't want us to think critically. And so
Right.
if they expose the real history of this country, we would all think critically about like what this country was founded on, what changes this country has made, what changes this country has not made.
Mm-hmm.
Many of them have not been made, y'all.
Mm-hmm.
Really deeply understanding that, we would not be able to still exist as the same nation. And they are very aware of that. Even now, people are being radicalized through experience. Now people don't need theory. People don't need to read Marx to understand that, like, yo, shit is fucked up, because their lives are fucked up right now.
Yeah.
But if people really like had like the educational basis that we do of like all of the atrocities of the CIA, of the US military, of, you know, slavery, of white supremacist violence, of all of the race massacres that happened from 1919 to 1925, 58, by the way. Like, if they knew the history of all of these things, they would have no choice but to see this country for what it is. But that's why they don't teach those things. They don't want us to know those things. They don't want us to think critically. They don't want us to be empathetic or see each other as humans or try to understand each other's experiences. That doesn't help them. It doesn't help them continue their two-party, you know, collusion fest. That doesn't help them.
Yeah.
It does not help them. We all have to stay low information. They have to make sure that we are not actually politically engaged, because knowing all these things, it makes you political. Politics is like being empathetic to the point where you want to change the system. That is political. So,
yeah,
I mean,
and I think, you know, that's on the education side. I think another arm of this sort of machine is the media, right? And I would compare how they've treated Gabby to how they treated Breonna Taylor, just as one example, who also was murdered by a white person. Is there any, right? How's that coverage contrasted, right? So it seems like it's very pervasive in almost every topic that we discuss, that there's kind of this underlying tone to all of this, right? And a framing that always guides people to think that the United States and all of our institutions are doing the best they can, and you know what I mean?
Exceptional.
Yeah. So do you see independent media as something that could start to chip away at that a little bit? Like, do you think as people move online, with our generation kind of telling cable news to fuck off and not reading the mainstream legacy papers and turning instead to online independent sources, do you see that as a sign for some hope for the future?
Absolutely. Motherfuckers can't afford cable. Cable is expensive.
Yeah.
like what? Of course, we're not getting our information from the silo. And then on top of that, we are experiencing these things. Like, what the thing about it is, like, the generational divide right now, where people can be propagandized by the media, is the fact that older people still watch CNN because they can afford to watch CNN. They can afford to watch MSNBC. They can afford to watch Bloomberg News and all of these news stations, because those are on premium cable channels. They can afford that. And that's where they're getting their news from. So of course they're going to be able to be fed this endless silo of just bullshit. Of course they're going to be able to be told, you know, these like homeowner targeted messages, because a majority of older people, especially older white folks, are homeowners, regardless of whether they're, you know, Democratic or Republican. Like, they're established, they have wealth, they have these certain things. So like the messaging is going to be, you know, tailored to that. If a working class person that has a high school education or a GED turns on CNN, that shit is not accessible. That shit is not for you. They're not going to they're not talking to you. So like, it's so, I hate how inaccessible politics is. And what I love about independent news media is we are all regular people that talk regular. You know what I'm saying? Like,
yeah.
We are all regular people. We use regular language. We don't use these like astronomically huge words to describe, you know, the political processes and all the procedures that are happening. And we're telling you real things with nuance, and not because we're getting paid to, because no one's paying us. This shit does not pay well. Okay.
No, it doesn't. No. No,
Like,
especially with those new YouTube algorithms, like we're getting shafted out here. It's don't anyone at home think that we're all making good money for this independent shit.
but yeah, like I want more people to support independent media just because we need to have more democratically controlled things in this in this space. Like we can no longer rely on sources that do not serve us, and the news media as it currently stands is a business, and so of
Yeah.
course it's going to fight for business interests. Of course it's
Yeah.
going to fight for tax cuts for their friends and for themselves because that's the class that they're in. So
Yeah,
if
they
you
do the
want class conscious news, you have to come to an independent news source. But like I can tell y'all, I'm broke. So, you know, we're
What,
in
you
the
mean you don't
same
make
boat.
millions of dollars from military contractors and banks? Or is that what you're saying?
Oh my, you know what? Raytheon, they just called me the other day. I had to
Yeah.
decline their call. Like what?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. Well, so to pivot to a slightly more positive and hopeful topic, can you talk about your organization and the community building and organizing that you do?
absolutely. So, my grassroots organization is Freedom Fighters DC. We were founded last summer. And we are a Black-led organization that does mutual aid and direct aid all around DC. We also do youth outreach as well. We're trying to expand ourselves, expand our programs. Right now, we're in the middle of actually rewriting our message to make sure that it fits all the things that we've learned, especially as everything has changed. And we're just really committed to the theory of change, of knowing that it's going to be people power and people taking care of people that actually change the system, and not just electoralism. I say this as somebody that works for a candidate. Um,
Right.
that shit is not gonna work at all.
Yeah. Yeah.
Love everybody to death. You know, I guess we should not let people that have way too much money like continue to write legislation, I guess. But that's not where the change is gonna be at. And what I really love in my grassroots organization and the community organizing that we do is that we are uh powering the social movement by meeting people's material needs. We are telling people, we are talking to people about abolition. We are talking to people about what it looks like to move more towards a care society and not a society that's filled with violence and with competition.
Hmm.
And people can actually take the space to listen. They can take the space to hear because they've been cared for. Their needs have been met. Their rent has been paid. They're like there are certain stresses are being taken off of them. Um, but I will say, please donate to my grassroots org. We try to do everything like cost effectively, but these things do add up. We feed 200 people a week, at least. So
Wow. My
$5,
gosh. That
$10.
Yeah,
Yeah.
please don't. That is fantastic. That is really important work. I had no idea you guys had grown to that site. That's fantastic stuff. I'm
Yeah.
really glad to hear that. Can you talk a little bit about this? Is something I find myself talking about a lot, but it's because I think it's really important. Can you talk about how those two are actually, in my view, quite intertwined? Like I think any candidate worth their salt will say, you guys are going to have to be the ones. You know, like I can't single-handedly change this whole fucking system. So I need that grassroots pressure and this kind of thing. Can you? I also think that that kind of community building builds trust in a way that then makes people more receptive to leftist politics. So can you just talk a little bit about how those two things really are? They're not separate. They're kind of intertwined and both can be important in their own right.
Absolutely. So, what I will say about this is the only faith I have in electoral politics is if there's an inside outside strategy and the power lever is on the outside. If the
Hmm.
power lever is not on the outside, then we have what we have right now. You know, I have met all of the elected officials that we call the squad. I've some of them still follow me on social media for some reason. I guess they like to be talked to crazy. um, but um, you know, I don't think they value the relationship between activists and elected officials that should be there. You know, in Europe, in countries like France, where you have like the Yellow Vest movement, and you have like the Labor Party, you have the leftist party, you have these people that are actually willing to work with activists and put forth legislation for activists activists, and say like, hey, like, it's either you listen to me or they go out in the streets and they start fucking shit up. I don't know what you want me to do. Like, that's what they're going to do. And that's the type of relationship I feel like we need to have. And they need to stand and be okay with that, because I can tell y'all right now, like, y'all are not going to lose re-election. Like, you're in. Like, people like you because they thought that you were going to be activists in Congress. You're in. So now it's time to actually put your money where your mouth is and put your actions where you say your principles are, because right now they're not matching up. But I feel like it's very important to build that community trust and to build that mutual bridge of not only saying like, hey, like, we're going to help you write this legislation. We're going to be the grassroots pressure on the outside. We will organize the boycotts. We will organize the actions outside of the Capitol, but you have to fucking show up. You have to be there. And that's how this has to work. And go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say on that topic, I didn't know that you had met all of them. I'm curious to get your thoughts on, like, I've been very critical of the squad. I also do think there's kind of this tribalism on both sides of this, where people either deem them all to be perfect and then work backwards from that, or deem them all to be the devil and then work backwards from that. What is your take on that? I mean, do you think that they're all well-intentioned in making mistakes? Do you think there's any element of disingenuity to them, if that's even a fucking word? I might have just made that up. But do you know what I like where on the scale do you think they are relative to how we all viewed them when they first kind of came up?
I think that they are people that are comfortable, and that they are people that they do not trust. They do not trust activists. They do not trust organizers. Right now, they're trusting their consultants. They're trusting their staff. They're trusting each other, in the information that in that silo. And you know, Cori Bush especially, like, Cori Bush and Alex, I spent the most time, like, I've seen Cori Bush the most, and I probably had the most in-depth conversations with Alex. Alex gives me like, I feel like she used to have her heart in the right place, but I really think that it's a mix of maybe trauma, maybe it's a mix of comfortability, but she's definitely not the same person that, you know, I saw on the election trail, on the campaign trail. I mean, she's definitely not the same activist that I was donating to in 2018. I don't get that vibe from her. Love her to death. But I think she needs to just stand in her truth and stand in the fact that, you know, shit did change her, and that no matter how badly she wanted to try to be a one-term congressperson, she didn't do that. And I feel like because she knows she's going to continue to win, she would rather, you know, make her experience comfortable than actually fight for the things that she said she was going to fight for. And I have a problem with that. I really do. Cori, I feel like she's an activist. I feel like she's a Black woman, a formerly incarcerated Black woman who's just really trying to, you know, do the best that she can. I feel like sometimes she does not take the advice from people that she should be taking the advice from. I feel like, you know, she plays it safe way too much, and that's not what the fuck we sent y'all there for. We did not send y'all there to be friends with Nancy Pelosi. We did not send y'all there to compromise with Republicans. We did not send y'all there to compromise with moderate fucking Democrats. That is not what we wanted. We do not agree with Nancy Pelosi. We don't even want to be the same fucking party as Nancy Pelosi. And if a lot of us could be, we'd probably be in a different variety of parties. If this country was actually a democratic country, we would all be in a different variety of parties. There would be probably dozens of different parties in this country. Let's be real. So, you know, I just think that Cori's just trying to walk that line, and, you know, it's not beneficial to our agenda. It's not beneficial to our principles. It's not beneficial to working class people, especially not Black working class people who are still being exploited by the system. And those are the people that you said you were there to fight for, specifically, a lot. So that means that you need to put some fight and some grit behind that. People like Ayanna Pressley. Ayanna Pressley was a liberal. She's a Elizabeth Warren girl.
Well, she was a Clinton surrogate. I mean, she actually, like, in 2016, she claimed that Hillary was more progressive than Bernie. That was her position. Well, just okay on the you made the point about the parties. This is summed up very nicely by a Ralph Nader quote, which I love. He said he used to say to his dad growing up, "I wish there was more than two parties," and his dad would say, "I wish there was more than one." And I think that kind of sums up the partisan issue. You're right. There should be a whole myriad of parties that, you know, we can all compete in, and that would actually apply pressures even to the parties in power. And I really love the way that the inside out approach with the power on the outside. Is that, you think, the key to this? Like, do you think there's still value in these representatives if that power is kind of shifted to the outside?
Absolutely. And, you know, I'm probably not gonna be the most popular thing to say, but I think people need to have the courage to be uncomfortable. I can tell y'all right now, you know, there are material needs that we need to start to build the infrastructures in order to take care of. We need to make sure that there is a mutual aid version of childcare. People are gonna need that. We need to make sure that we are raising strike funds and rent funds because people are going to need that. We need to make sure we have food. We urban gardens, start growing vegetables. People are going to need that. But it's not going to be the same as what people currently have. Like, shit is going to have to get uncomfortable first. And I think that a lot of people understand that. And that's why people back away from, you know, actually fully investing in the movement, fully investing in, you know, striking, fully investing in doing these things. But we are the powerful ones. Our labor powers all of this. Yeah. If we all just stop, all this shit stops. And when we dispel the individual shame of poverty and realize that poverty is a policy decision, realize that poverty is something that people are deciding to inflict on us. It's not because we don't have enough. Scarcity is bullshit. There is enough, but we all have to be willing to fight for that and represent ourselves in fighting for that, you know. And being the power lever, being on the outside, I mean, when we all realize our power, we'll realize that it already is. When we realize that we can organize because it's been done before, then we can do that. And then we can start striking fear in the hearts of not only these progressives, but all of these elected officials, because these parties are working together. I was talking to somebody yesterday, and they were telling me they were so tired of the Democratic and the Republican Party fighting. I'm like, these motherfuckers are not fighting. They're not fighting. They're working together. They're in the back high-fiving each other like, oh yeah, good job on CNN, Chuck. You did good. Yeah. They're all buddies. They all go to Martha's Vineyard together. They're in the Hamptons together. Their grandchildren play together. Fuck do you mean? They're not fighting. They benefit from this shit regardless. If the government shuts down on Friday, guess what? All them motherfuckers are still going to get paid. Their health insurance is still going to be paid. Their security details are still going to be there. They don't experience a government shutdown, so they don't give a fuck. So it's just like, we cannot idolize these people. They are public servants. Politicians are people we put on fucking pedestals. These people are public servants. We pay them. They don't pay us. I know it feels like it, but we pay them. We pay the taxes. We give them the labor. We provide the labor. It's us. It's always been us. So like, now we have to organize for us. I mean, maybe, you know, it'll be like nice patty cakes and everybody will see like the little marches in the street, but people been marching. We've been doing that. So I think it's time to try some different shit, y'all. That's all I'm saying. It's got to try some different stuff. Okay. Yeah. That's not going to work. Not going to work.
So on that note, you said we've been marching, right? Like this, I mean, going back, this latest string of protests coming out of George Floyd, I mean, that was what, a year and a half ago or something. And we did see a lot of marches for a long time and protests and things like that. And yet I didn't see literally any changes policy wise at all. So like, where's the disconnect there in your mind?
The disconnect is all of these grass top organizations that are also working for the establishment that people keep looking to for guidance. Like last summer's protest should have been a very unique and explosive political moment where we changed fucking everything because the whole world was watching. I don't know if people know about the Act Up campaign. about the anti-war protests, but that was one of the main chants in both those protests. The whole world is watching, and they got real material changes from that. And it's the whole world was watching last summer. People were marching in different countries for Black lives in America because it is obvious. It is obvious. I come from a family of immigrants. I have a lot of friends that are also like first generation as well. They always say, and my family always says, like, the way Black people in America are treated versus like other countries, like, it's bad. Like, things can be bad, crime can be what it is. But the way Black people are treated in America, that shit is abhorrent. It's abhorrent.
Yeah.
So it's just, I don't know. It's just, we got nothing. We got nothing. And it's because organizations like Black Lives Matter, all of these other like organizations like the Urban League, the NAACP, Al Sharpton and them at the National Action Network, they were so busy telling people, calm down, don't ask for too much. We need to be realistic. Fuck that. Fuck realistic. For real. Fuck realism. Fuck pragmatic. Fuck practical. I don't want to hear those words ever again. I don't, because they didn't think it was they weren't worried about what was pragmatic, realistic, and all that other shit when they built this country in the way that they did. When the founding fathers sat their racist asses down and wrote the Constitution and wrote all these Declaration of Independence, they did not expect 20-story buildings and cars that move at fucking 100 miles per hour to be on the streets of this land. They did not see that. So we had the opportunity to imagine a better society and then materialize our imagination, and we fucking wasted it. We fucking wasted it. And then we elected Joe Biden. Oh my God. He was literally a Strom Thurmond Democrat, y'all. I was
actually going to say that earlier when you were talking about the parties mingling together. He literally eulogized Strom Thurmond, like literally eulogized the guy. He also said at one point that he didn't want his children growing up in a racial jungle. And at a different point, and this was as late as I think 2007 or 2008 when he was running with Obama, he said Barack Obama is and I have this quote memorized. He said Barack Obama is the first sort of mainstream African American who is articulate and bright and clean. That was Joe Biden in 2007. Okay, so like to your point, yes, it's we have this extraordinary misperception. What's that?
You ain't Black if you don't vote for Joe Biden, though. Remember that.
But see, and then there's this misperception, right? Yeah. That he is somehow on the side of the Black community. You remember when he chastised Black activists going into his when he was president-elect, and the media sat there and defended him? I mean, it's absolutely insane. It's absolutely insane. What that's actually a great thing to ask you about too. The difference between the like CNN pretending that they support Black Lives Matter or sort of outwardly saying that they support these movements and the substance behind that and the framing of the coverage. What do you see behind some of those dynamics? I don't mean CNN in particular, but you know what I mean. The mainstream press, where they very much want to outwardly make people believe that they support movements like this, but then clearly they base their coverage in nonsense and frame it in ways that actually hurts these movements.
I think that not only CNN, but even Will Smith said in GQ something about how we should have talked about defund the bad police.
Oh,
what? Like, instead of chastising activists, Black people, abolitionists, people that have been studying, working, doing this work on the ground, the Chicago Justice Lab does fantastic work, and everybody should Google them right now. Like, activists have really been studying this shit, and Black people have been living it. Working class Black people that just exist every day, we've been living it. So for people that don't even live that experience, to chastise oppressed people for having very realistic demands of survival and humanity, they want to water it down. They want to co-opt the language. They want to pretend like they're down. It's because they don't want their power to be threatened. Cultural issues, civil rights bills, that doesn't threaten their power. That doesn't threaten their power. But dismantling the police state that protects their capital, that threatens their power. dismantling the financial power structure of this country and targeting the nucleus of their power, which is the financial and the war powers, that disrupts, that shakes up their world. Talking about wealth redistribution in a real way to pay for reparations, because a lot of Black activists are, that disrupts their power. That bothers them. So of course they're not actually going to be out here talking about some, oh yeah, abolish the police, when we absolutely fucking should, because there are plenty of countries that do not police in the same ways that we do.
Yeah.
And there are also plenty of examples within this country that show you that the safest communities don't have more police. They have more resources. They have more money. They have more programs. they have more art centers, museums, parks. That's what they have. That's what the safest communities have. But our communities have liquor store. We didn't build those. We didn't put that infrastructure in our neighborhoods on our own. That was placed there for us. In our ghettos, in our redlined ghettos. So you cannot tell me that we should not defund the police if you don't even deal with the police in the same way, because they're protecting you and your capital. You need to shut the fuck up. This is not your place to speak. I don't give a fuck if you're Black or not. If you're a Black billionaire, shut up.
Yeah.
Shut it up. Period.
Yeah.
Like, please.
No, obviously law enforcement in this country, the first law enforcement agencies were literal slave catchers. The sheriff's star that we see all around the country is born out of what slave catchers used to wear. And more just like literally in the way that they're formed, police are there to what? To protect the property of the rich from the poor. I mean, that's very literally, that's their job description, right? It's a large portion of it.
Don't let them steal. Don't let them break shit. Don't let them loiter.
Yeah. Who's that protecting? Is that protecting the person who has nothing? Of course it's not. It's criminalizing homelessness. It's criminalizing poverty. It's absolutely. And one other thing, and this is kind of circling back, but you mentioned the things that make them very uncomfortable. How about a general strike? Would that you think make the powers that be uncomfortable?
Absolutely. I think a real general strike that isn't just a day. I think a real general strike that I think honestly maybe like a month, 2 months stretch. We're squatting in our homes because fuck y'all. And we're not working for y'all. No, we're not. We're not about to give you we're not about to give you no labor. We're not. My kids are taken care of. Like, y'all already aren't educating our kids, so I guess we're homeschooling them anyway. Like, no, we're not doing it. We're not doing it. We have learning circles. The teachers have volunteered to go ahead and just to do learning circles for our children, because we're also not funding your privatization of public education either. We're not doing it. Like a general strike that actually stops this system, that actually stops their money, that actually cuts off their wealth, because our labor is their wealth. Our tax dollars that's their wealth. That is the same money they use to recycle back into their military contractors, into their insider trading, back into their stocks. That's it. We are the ones keeping all of that together. We're the ones that are keeping all of that moving. We have the power to stop. I promise you, we can stop. And the more people can, I think that, especially as activists, we want to make things realistic for people. We want to be able to show people stats and graphs, and if you do this, this is the material. This is not something that we can quantify for you. This is not something that we can just tell you or show you a video on. There are plenty of successful historical things that we can point to, but who the fuck knows what this shit is actually going to look like in this society? But I can tell you that it's not going to look any better or any fucking worse than where we are right now, because right now people are dying in the richest country in the world because they don't have health care. 46% of children were food insecure before. Low-income children were food insecure before the pandemic. Before that. So we're at rock bottom. Our earth is literally crumbling. I don't know if y'all remember this because so much shit has happened, but the ocean was on fire earlier this year.
Yes.
We're already fucked. I promise you, we're already fucked.
Yeah.
We can stop. We can stop. Then don't worry about nothing is scarier than where we are right now. I promise you. I promise you.
Absolutely. And our labor really is everything. I mean, these corporations, they very literally have to shut down if our labor isn't there, which means their profit stops. That is their money. So if
And
we
no
stop
taxes getting
providing
paid,
our
the
labor,
wages not getting paid.
yeah, that's but I think you're right. Like, in order for this to be successful, people have to be prepared to get uncomfortable, and we need to take preparations to make sure that people can be as comfortable as possible, even though we acknowledge that they will have to be uncomfortable. And I'm very hopeful that at some point we can get to a place where that is a successful movement. But it feels like capitalism so beats us down that it makes it even harder to do something like a general strike, right? Because people don't have savings. People don't what are you supposed to do, right? You're going to go buy 2 months of food. Who the fuck can afford that, right? So yeah, I'm looking forward to the forum very much, or the summit rather, very much. And I'm hopeful that will grab some attention for this kind of movement, because I think that is, you got to hit them in the pocketbooks. That's really, we can march all we want. You got to hit them in the pocketbooks at some point. And I'm hopeful that we can get there.
We need more labor organizers. Seriously. Like, we need more labor organizers to get on board with the general strike. We need more unions to get on board with the general strike, because like, workers deserve better. Black people in this country deserve better. Indigenous people in this country deserve better. And we need to stop until we get better. Period.
Yeah.
Period. Yeah. Because I mean, of course they want you to constantly like worry about, oh, I have to make it to this hourly job. I have to make it to my next hourly job so that way I can feed my kids and stuff like that. We need to start taking care of each other. And the people that have the means, or say that they support, our movement, the Jimmy Dores of the world, the Hassan Pikers, go ahead and open up your pockets, bruh. Run it. Run it.
Yeah.
Because if you support this shit, make sure that you're donating to these general strike funds, because we're going to need them. The people are going to need them. We have to support each other. We're going to have to support each other. So,
yeah. Well, and lastly, can you just give one more plug here for Fred Hampton and for your organization? Where can people help out? Where can people donate? Where can people find your work and your content and all that?
So I know we have like a Ko-fi thing, so I do want to plug that for my fellow comrades. Fred Hampton Leftists does have a Ko-fi thing. Like, find it on Ko-fi. It's like I think it's like kofi.com/Fred Hampton Left, something like that. You can follow us on Twitter at Fred Hampton Leftists. And like, the General Strike Summit, I believe, will be in November, towards the end of November. So just stay close to our. Sorry, follow us on social media for updates. That was a way better way to put that.
There you go.
Social media for updates. Yeah. And we want it to be very like effective. We want more labor organizers. So if there are people that you feel like are missing from our coverage, or if there are people that you feel like we need to highlight, whether they have a high follower count or not, if there's an organizer in your fucking neighborhood that is organizing against evictions right now, point them our way. If there's an organizer right now that is helping do labor organizing for the Amazon warehouse in your district, send them our way, because those are the type of people we also want to highlight on this panel. And we just really hope that everybody learns something, and that we can finally gain that collective strength to actually like make this message spread, and get this thing rolling, because fuck the government.
That's a fantastic ending. And lastly, Afeni, your organization, Freedom Fighters DC, do you guys have a Patreon or something? Where can people go to donate?
So, you know what? Just now that you just said that sounds like a really good idea, making us a Patreon, actually. But so right now, I would just follow us at Freedom Fighters DC 202. We do have a Cash App. A lot of people don't trust Cash App. So we're trying to set up some different fundraising things right now. GoFundMe stole $14,000 from us, y'all. So yeah. So please follow us for updates on our fundraising. We have literally basically been cut off of our funds at this point, and we've been fighting with them for months to get our money back, and they just finally told us that they're not giving it back to us because we're a hate group, apparently. Thank you so much, white supremacists. Thank you.
I'm sorry, feeding people is hateful. That's wow.
Yeah, they deemed us as a hate group because when people reported us as a hate group, thank you so much, white supremacists. And yeah, they took $14,000 from us. So
Wow.
we
Well,
are
if
down
any of my
bad, y'all.
viewers,
Help.
yeah, if any of my viewers happen to have 14 grand sitting around, we'd love to make up that difference there. I have a feeling that's not the case for most of them. So,
If you have 5 cents, if you have 50
yeah.
cents, please donate it to Freedom Fighters DC. We will make it work. We go to the dollar store for the hygiene products. We will find a way. Okay.
There you go. Well, I encourage all of my viewers, follow Fred Hampton Leftist at Fred Hampton Left. I've had Afeni's Twitter up on the screen here throughout this interview at Red is Ari. Please make sure you're following all of them and all their work, and go donate to Afeni's organization if you can. And Afeni, thank you so much. I really enjoyed this conversation. I hope we can do this again.
Thank you.
So I thought that was a fantastic segment. Just want to reiterate what I said at the end there. If you can support Afeni's organization, do so. If you're not following Fred Hampton Leftists, go do so. Really fantastic work that they're doing. They are on the ground a lot doing activism and also bringing political commentary and social commentary to the mix as well. Support independent media, support Fred Hampton Leftists, support Afeni, and make sure you're following all their content as well. So to pivot quite nicely, actually, into a topic that we discussed during that segment, a report has come out, a study that demonstrates that police killings are drastically underreported, which is something that we already kind of knew but couldn't tangibly put numbers to. This is ABC News. More than half of U.S. killings by police go underreported, according to a study. A new study highlights a pattern of racism in policing, authors say. A new study on fatal police violence shows more than half of killings by police were left unreported in the last 40 years, and that Black Americans were estimated to be 3.5 times more likely to die from police violence than white Americans. Researchers compared data from the National Vital Statistics System, a federal tracker of deaths in the United States, with 3 independent non-government open source databases, Fatal Encounters, Mapping Police Violence, and Accounted. From 1980 to 2019, there were 30,800 deaths from police violence. Just take that in for a second, you guys. I want to make sure everybody understands that in other industrialized nations, the number of deaths per year is in the single or maybe low double digits total. Like, we're not the number of deaths that are questionable or that are egregious. Total killings by police are in the single or double digits in most industrialized nations. For us, nearly 31,000 over a 40-year stretch. I mean, just digest that for a second, right? Which is 17,100 more deaths than the NVSS reported, according to the study by researchers from the University of Washington and published in Lancet. The study found that the NVSS underreported 55.5% of these deaths overall, but that percentage rose to 59.1% when reporting deaths among Black Americans. Quote, police violence and racism is really a public health problem, senior author Mohsen Naghavi, I apologize if I'm absolutely butchering that name, told ABC News. The NVSS did not respond to ABC News' request for comment. The rate of police killings for non-Hispanic Black victims was about 3.5 times higher than that of non-Hispanic white people, and Hispanics were 1.8 times more likely to be killed by police than non-Hispanic white people. The study confirms a pattern of systemic racism in policing, predominantly burdening communities of color, the study's co-author Eve Wohl says. So at every part of this, there is racism involved, right? Systemic racism involved. So Black Americans are not only 3.5 times more likely to be killed by police in the first place, they're also more likely to have their deaths go underreported or unreported. So police here, for obvious reasons, out of self-preservation, refusing to report the violence that they inflict upon the communities they are supposed to protect, and disproportionately inflict upon communities of color and impoverished communities. This is just kind of a study that reveals and puts numbers to what we already kind of knew, right? Congress did, I don't remember exactly how long ago this was, but Congress did insist at one point that police departments throughout the country report those that they kill to a federal database, but it has long been known that a lot of departments choose not to report to that database, and there is no consequence for doing so. This study just kind of puts numbers to the extent to which that is a problem and the extent to which all of this gets swept under the rug. So even, I just want to point out, you guys, the protests that we've seen over the last couple of years following George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and too many other names to mention, those were citing numbers that themselves were watered down. I just want to point that out. So when we were hearing, these protests actually forced some mainstream news outlets to report on the incredible racial discrepancies in police violence, and incarceration, by the way. That's a whole nother discussion. Those numbers that were being reported on, as egregious as they sounded, were watered down. That's what this study has found. So I just really want to emphasize that police need to be abolished, and we need to start from scratch. You guys, there's no reforming a system that has this many problems cooked into it from inception. You cannot just reform something that is rooted in and built up upon racism and classism and violence. You just can't do it. Okay. I mentioned this in the Afeni interview. Police in this country literally born out of slave catchers. Those were the first law enforcement departments in this country. When that's your starting point, you can't reform it. You need to just remove yourself of it and start from scratch. Okay. Now, obviously, there needs to be some sort of public safety department. I think we should avoid a violent and heavily armed version of that. But I think we should have some department made up perhaps more of social workers and things than violent officers, that is there to help people in situations where they may need help, or there to enforce laws in some way, shape, or form. But obviously, as Afeni mentioned, that is done in other countries in such a drastically different way that we know we can remove ourselves of our current system and build a significantly better system, a healthier system, a system that actually serves the communities instead of a system that brutalizes them and throws them in jail, right? We can do so much better than this, you guys. So to see that like half of these, over half, 59% of Black people killed by police go unreported. I mean, if that on top of the already egregious statistics does not make you think that we need to abolish and start from scratch, I don't know what will. And this just kind of puts numbers to something that I think we all already kind of had a decent idea of. I would like to see some of that activism, some of those marches, some of that momentum, some of that noise continue. And unfortunately, it seems to me that following that sort of movement after George Floyd, it seems like some of that has fallen off. And unfortunately, it's not like it fell off because we got policy concessions. Joe Biden increased funding to police from federally subsidized funding for police. He increased it. Okay. We know from the Obama era reforms that they do nothing. They do fuck all, you guys. Minneapolis police was one of the first departments to embrace all of the suggested reforms from the Obama administration. Look at how'd that work out? Anyone watching the news over the last 2 years knows how that worked out. Okay. Reforms don't work. So when Biden says he's providing funding and then wanting reforms, we know where this road leads, right? We need to defund and abolish police and start from scratch. And that's all that there is to it. And this study, again, just emphasizes that, really pounds it home, puts it right in front of your face in a way that is very difficult to ignore. So I would love to see that activism continue, and I want to encourage my viewers to engage in whatever activisms or opportunities, rather, for activism and organizing and protest around this issue arise in your area. Make sure that you're getting involved. Make sure that you're calling out police. Make sure that you are, keeping the volume up on this issue, so to say. I want to talk briefly about Britney Spears' conservatorship. Her dad removed from the conservatorship. Jamie Spears gave a quote saying that he thought this was bad for Britney. The reason I want to talk about this is not necessarily because of the anecdotal example or the specific example, though I think Britney Spears deserves to be able to make decisions for herself. But this is actually a pretty broad problem in this country. I saw someone cite that 1.3 million Americans are under conservatorships of one form or another. And it seems to me a program or a system that is ripe for abuse, that can be, abused by people who, like Jamie Spears, take control of somebody else's fortune or career or decision-making processes, right? And that is something that needs some serious evaluation. And I'm not like some expert on this issue. I have not done said evaluation, but I will be looking into this issue, and I hope that this issue gets some prevalence on the national stage, because I think we need to reform how we go about conservatorships. I don't think that is something we should be engaging in, except for in perhaps the very most extreme circumstances. And clearly 1.3 million Americans do not need to be under conservatorship. I think that's pretty obvious. So I would like to see this evaluated. I would like to see this story hopefully sort of spark a fire in people, because that's a lot of people that don't get to make decisions for their own lives. It's like the epitome of freedoms, being able to decide how you're going to spend your money, who you're going to date. Like, apparently her dad was telling her who she can and can't date. He's controlling her career, when she does shows and where, and all this kind of shit, and then getting to take the money from it too. So I get that not all of those 1.3 million are in the same situation as Britney Spears in terms of having a fortune to control, or a career that has that kind of leverage or power or wealth associated to it. But in any case, people should be able to decide what they want to do with their lives, broadly speaking, right? Who they want to date, who they want to be friends with, what they want to do with their free time, how they want to handle their career, how they want to spend their wealth, or I don't mean wealth to like how they want to spend whatever they have, right? And if people don't have that freedom, I think that needs to be looked into, especially if it's to the extent that 1.3 million Americans don't have that freedom. So I'm hopeful this story will spark some discussion and debate on this topic, and I hope that we can evolve that system or that program in a way that may make it more healthy, to say the least. And lastly here, you guys, this is a new series that's going to be a collaboration between David Sirota and the Daily Poster and Breaking Points with Crystal and Sagar. Every Friday, they're going to be taking David's reporting, and both groups will kind of be promoting it. David does some really fantastic work. If you don't follow David Sirota and the Daily Poster, his work there, I really encourage you to do so. This is a story about Josh Gottheimer, who is one of the corporatists that is towing the line trying to pass the shitty bipartisan infrastructure bill. And in what he won't tell you, he says he just wants that bill passed. But obviously, everyone paying even a modicum of attention to this understands that what he wants is to remove the leverage that progressives have to pass the reconciliation bill. So this is Sirota going on Breaking Points and detailing how Gottheimer is the #1 recipient of private equity money in Congress, and that is overwhelmingly likely to be the reason why he's taking this position. It's out and out quid pro quo corruption that's being described here. Fantastic work from David, and good on Breaking Points for highlighting it. Enjoy this clip. We'll come back and discuss.
Very excited. This is our inaugural partnership segment with the Daily Poster and David Sirota. He joins us now. So I explained this yesterday, but we're officially entering into a partnership. We're going to do this weekly recurring segment to post on Friday. Obviously, we're promoting it to our people. Your incredible reporting that you can't find anywhere else. You're going to push the segment out to your people. So great little collaboration here that I'm very excited about. David, welcome.
Good to see you, David.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Solidarity.
Yeah, of course.
100%.
Absolutely. That's what this is all about. So you have a great piece, you and Andrew Perez. Let's go ahead and throw this up on the screen. Look, we know the surface level negotiations with regard to the reconciliation package and the infrastructure bill, but what you have been getting at is what's really going on behind the scene, and what's really driving these various characters to do what they're doing. In particular, you focus here on Josh Gottheimer. You describe as the billionaire's Democratic bagman. He is the House's top recipient of private equity cash. David, lay out for us how that is impacting his approach to the reconciliation bill.
So Gottheimer is one of 8 or 9 House Democrats who's trying to undermine the so-called two-track strategy, the strategy by which the only way to really pass the reconciliation bill is to keep it linked to that infrastructure bill. He's one of the 8 House Democrats who's trying to de-link the two bills and pass the infrastructure bill alone, which would, many believe, would ultimately kill the reconciliation bill. Now, as you said, as we reported, he is the top recipient of campaign cash in the U.S. House from private equity, the private equity industry. The private equity industry, you will not be surprised to learn, has lots of things that it objects to in the reconciliation bill, particularly all of the potential tax measures that could be in a final reconciliation bill. Even more specifically, things like the carried interest tax loophole, which is the loophole that allows private equity moguls to classify their income as capital gains rather than income, and therefore pay a much lower tax rate on that income than a typical American worker pays on their income. There's also provisions in there raising raising taxes for billionaires. Obviously, the private equity industry has lots of very, very wealthy people in it. And of course, the private equity industry has an incentive to only pass the infrastructure bill, because in the infrastructure bill are provisions that are designed to encourage and push state and local governments to fund infrastructure projects through so-called public-private partnerships. An example, Blackstone is a private equity giant that is Gottheimer's number one, their donors are his number one campaign contributors. Blackstone is heavily invested in the infrastructure world, is heavily interested in those kinds of public-private partnerships. And finally, Blackstone and other private equity firms are very invested in the fossil fuel industry. They have an incentive, therefore, to not want the reconciliation bill to pass. The reconciliation bill's programs designed to transition the country or begin transitioning the country away from fossil fuels.
So great reporting there from David Sirota. And I know that some people on the left will kind of say, like, we already kind of know this is the case, right? Like, I understand I'm probably kind of preaching to the choir here with my audience that, hey, this corruption exists and this is why any decent policy is opposed by the corporate, duopoly. But I think it's important to continue to emphasize those specifics and make sure that people understand the mechanisms that are at play here. So Sirota does a great job reporting on the ins and outs of corruption in DC, and clearly Gottheimer engaging in quid pro quo corruption here. It's so obvious on the surface. It's so obvious, right? And I want to make sure everyone understands the framing trick at play there. Gottheimer and others will say, well, we just want to make sure that the bipartisan bill is passed. We have this great incentive of trying to pass an infrastructure bill, right? Well, first of all, that infrastructure bill is absolute trash. There's hardly anything good in it. It's basically a bunch of corporate giveaways. Second, it's not their true incentive. Their true incentive is to squash the reconciliation bill, because the second that the bipartisan bill passes, there is no longer enough leverage for progressives to get $3.5 trillion or anything close to it done in the reconciliation bill. So they hide their true intent with framing here. And again, I recognize I am probably preaching to the choir with a lot of my audience, but it needs to be said. It's very important. We need to continue to report on the ins and outs of these kinds of mechanisms and how things are misframed in DC. So I want to encourage you guys to follow David Sirota's work at the Daily Poster. He routinely details the corruption that we see from DC politicians and others as well, like governors, etc. They really just dive into critiquing the powerful. And wanted to note that Gottheimer, who has been one of the loudest voices opposing the reconciliation bill in favor of the bipartisan bill, clearly engaging in that direct quid pro quo corruption. So we see this with Manchin, we see this with Sinema, we see this all too often in DC, but it's always worth sharing those details. So Josh Gottheimer, not really well-intentioned here, obviously. He's not trying to pass a bill that helps people. He's trying to squash another bill that actually helps people. So don't let that frame job from not just these corporate politicians, but the mainstream media that support them. Don't let that sway you in your views of what's going on currently at the national level in DC. Obviously, electoral politics only a small portion of what really makes a difference here. You guys, I like the way that who was it that came up with this? I think it was Compton J over at Fred Hampton Leftist. The 80-20 thing, right? 80% activism and organizing and protests and on the ground stuff, grassroots stuff, and 20% electoral politics. I like that balance. I think that's a fair way to look at it. But I will obviously continue to report on the major political happenings in DC and what's going on at the national level as well. This $3.5 trillion really would tangibly change people's lives, you guys. Like as inadequate as it is, and I've detailed that too, really would change people's lives. To have universal pre-K, to expand Medicaid and Medicare, to have tuition-free community college, to do things to it, like inadequate as it may be, to at least take steps to address the climate crisis. These are all things that tangibly will improve people's lives, and we should understand why certain politicians are opposing that. Understand that Gottheimer and others, they're not looking to support policy that they can go brag to their district about, right? This isn't like democracy at play. Okay, these are all very popular provisions. So if they were to pass that $3.5 trillion reconciliation bill, they could go back to their districts and brag about it during election season. So you would think if Democratic pressures were actually working here, that they would want to pass these things. It's very obvious that instead they are just engaging in quid pro quo corruption. They are listening to their private equity donors in the case of Gottheimer, their big oil donors, their big bank donors, on and on. right? That's really what is happening here, and why we are unlikely to see anything close to adequate as it pertains to the reconciliation bill. But we will keep up with that story as we will keep up with anything that is of that level of importance, of that magnitude. So want to encourage everybody, once again, go to realprogressives.org if you want to learn more about us or contribute to our organization. All sorts of great articles and podcasts and shit that you can find there. Go to realprogressives.org. And also want to encourage people to watch the new Untouchables episode tonight, 8 Eastern, on this YouTube channel. If you're watching on YouTube, Real Progress in Action. New Untouchables details financial corruption, and a fantastic episode, I'm sure, coming up tonight. So with that, I will call it a day. I hope you guys all have a fantastic week, and I will see you next Sunday.